They said he was born pale as candle wax, hair white as linen left too long in the sun. But the midwife swore on the book itself, that when the infant opened his eyes she saw two reflections staring back at her. Hers. And another, Georgia, 1853. A plantation lost to time somewhere between Milledgeville and the edge of the Chattahoochee. No maps ever marked it right. People say the soil there still bleeds rust when it rains. They called him Devil's White. Not for what he did, no, that came later. But for how the light bent around him, for how the slaves stopped singing when he passed, for how even the overseers crossed themselves after dark. He never spoke, they said, just stood in the field at night facing the forest, whispering to something that answered back. Then, one dawn, the bells rang, though no one had died. And when the master came to ask why, the preacher simply said, because the boy's shadow finally learned to walk without him. Bell's Hollow was a place that refused to die. Even after the crops rotted and the wells turned black, people stayed, chained not by the soil, but by what had been promised there. The overseer said the land was blessed. The old ones whispered it was bought. After the boy came, strange things started happening. Chickens stopped laying. The dogs barked at nothing, then at everything. One woman, an old midwife, walked into the woods one morning and never came back. They found her shoes by the river filled with salt. At first, the master blamed superstition. He forbade talk of curses and pale children. But at night, even he wouldn't step outside. The slaves heard him praying through the shutters, naming saints no one in Georgia had ever heard of. Then, on the 9th night of August, the bells began to ring again. Frantic, uneven, like a warning too late to matter. When the neighbors came, the house was empty. No master, no overseers, no cries. Just silence and that same boy standing in the field, holding something that glowed faintly red in his hands. The sheriff's men took him away. But the bells, they kept ringing. They brought a doctor from Savannah, a man named Horace Bellwether, known for studying rare afflictions of the skin. He wore black gloves even in the heat, and his carriage was filled with books written in 3 languages, none of them English. When he saw the boy, he didn't speak for nearly an hour. He only stared, tracing symbols in the dust with the tip of his cane. Then softly he said, "This isn't albinism. This is memory made flesh the townsfolk didn't understand." But the doctor stayed. He took the boy into his care, building a small ward behind the old parsonage. Locals said he worked by candlelight every night, whispering to the boy in Latin, teaching him hymns that sounded more like curses. Children dared each other to sneak near the window, but none ever did twice. They said they heard 2 voices, one reciting scripture, the other answering it backward. Months passed. Bell's Hollow tried to forget, but the rain wouldn't stop, and the doctor's garden began to grow things that no one could name, pale vines that pulsed when touched, flowers that opened only beneath thunder. One night, the doctor's assistant ran screaming into town, his hands covered in soot, shouting, "The boy isn't human anymore." No one followed him back to the parsonage. By dawn, the building was gone, and only a circle of white ash where the door once stood. After the doctor vanished, the church in Bell's Hollow locked its doors. But some nights villagers swore they still heard music from inside, slow, aching like a funeral sung underwater. They called it the choir beneath the floorboards. Old Deacon Ellis was the first to go in. He was found the next morning on the steps, eyes open, mouth packed with dirt. They buried him facing north against the pastor's orders. No one spoke his name again. What the townsfolk didn't know was that the church had been built over something. An older foundation, brick and bone. The boy had been seen there once, before the fire, kneeling before the altar, whispering through the cracks in the floor. A freedman named Isaac later confessed he heard voices down there. Not screams, but pleas, like children praying in a language that made his teeth hurt. He said the ground throbbed when he stood over it like a heartbeat. One stormy night, the bell tower lit up with blue fire. Windows shattered. Every candle in town went out at once, and from that silence came a sound. 100 breaths drawn in unison, then one word spoken from beneath the church: remember. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The church stood empty again, but the pews were wet with something that wasn't water. After the church was sealed, the county sent a man to record what had happened, a clerk from Milledgeville named Thomas Crane. He carried a small leather book and a list of the dead. But when he reached Bell's Hollow, he found no graves, no bodies, no church records. Only whispers and that faint metallic smell that never left the air. He stayed 3 nights at the inn. Each morning he found new names written in his ledger, people who weren't on his list. The handwriting wasn't his. Some names were spelled backward, others smudged like they'd been written in fog. On the 3rd night, Crane went to the church ruins. He said he wanted proof, something to make sense of the stories. The innkeeper saw his lantern vanish behind the trees. He never returned. Weeks later, a farmer plowing near the river found Crane's ledger washed up on the bank. Every page was blank except the last. In faint brown ink were written 4 words: "The boy is remembering." The book was sent to Savannah for examination. The archivist who opened it died in his sleep that night, face turned toward the window, eyes wide, pupils white as milk. Since then, no one has tried to document Bell's Hollow again. The county calls it an unmarked district. Maps still skip over it like a wound the earth refuses to heal. In the years after the doctor's disappearance, the land itself began to change. Fields that once bore cotton now pulsed with a strange warmth, the soil soft and damp as if something underneath was breathing. Farmers left their plows mid-row, muttering that the earth moved when you looked away. Children who played near the tree line came home with their shoes filled with salt, their eyes glassy and distant. One girl spoke of a voice beneath her feet, calling her by name in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. The elders said the hollow was reclaiming what was stolen, that blood and memory had mingled too long, and now the land wanted to remember itself. But the preachers called it blasphemy. They said the devil had found a new church and its altar was the ground. Travelers reported seeing pale figures in the mist. Not ghosts exactly, but outlines of people waiting to be born again. Horses refused to pass the crossroads near the old chapel. The air grew heavy like a lung full of dust, and sometimes, at night, if you pressed your ear to the soil, you could hear it, the sound of something vast and sorrowful breathing beneath the roots, whispering through the dirt like prayer through broken teeth. He remembers us. In 1861, a recording was discovered in the archives of the First Baptist Seminary of Augusta, a wax cylinder marked only with the initials REH. The voice belonged to Reverend Elijah Harrow, the last known preacher of Bell's Hollow before the town's collapse. He had been missing for 8 years. The cylinder was his confession. His voice quivered through static, a rasp between prayer and madness. He spoke of visions beneath the pulpit, of hands pressing upward through the floorboards during his sermons. He said the choir had changed, that their mouths no longer moved, yet their song continued, as if the air itself were remembering them. He described the albino boy, older now, eyes pale and unblinking, standing in the nave, mouthing scripture backward while candles melted upward toward the ceiling. Harrow said he tried to flee, but the church would not let him go. He claimed the ground around the chapel had become flesh that dreamt of God. He ended the recording with one whisper, barely audible through the static. He's not the devil's child. He's the proof that heaven once lied. The cylinder was locked away in the seminary's vault. When archivists returned to study it a year later, it had melted, though no fire had touched the room. The Seminary of Augusta was not known for secrecy. It was where men of faith were trained to confront the darkness of sin, not hide it. Yet after Reverend Harrow's confession surfaced, something changed. Records show a new construction, a small windowless annex referred to in old blueprints only as the West Wing. No sermons were held there. No students entered. Those who asked were told it was for archival containment, but the workers who built it spoke differently. They said the walls were layered with lead and salt. They said no hammer struck twice in the same place, as though the room itself resisted being made. A custodian named Monroe later confessed he heard weeping inside when the doors were sealed. Not the sound of one man, but of 100 voices folded into one. The dean at the time, Father Langford, was said to have ordered the wing never to be opened again. In his private journals, now missing, he wrote, "Faith must build its own silence." After Langford's death, the seminary underwent renovations. The west wing was bricked over, its existence erased from all official records. But years later, when the foundation cracked during a flood, workers discovered something impossible. Behind the wall, the bricks were warm. In 1874, a restoration team cataloging the seminary's archives uncovered a painting sealed inside a false wall, its surface coated with soot, its frame carved with Latin scripture. No one knew who the artist was. The signature at the bottom read only, "H.B." The portrait showed a young boy standing in a field of dead cotton. His skin was pale, his eyes colorless, his hands clasped as if in prayer. But the strangest part wasn't the boy. It was the background. Rows of faceless figures rising behind him, their outlines painted in bone-white pigment that shimmered faintly in the dark. Experts believed it was symbolic, an allegory of sin and rebirth. But when they tried to move the canvas, 3 men fell ill within hours, complaining of migraines and the smell of iron. Under candlelight, restorers noticed something else. The boy's expression changed depending on who looked at him. To some he appeared sorrowful. To others he smiled faintly, as if recognizing them. A seminary scholar later claimed to have traced the boy's likeness to an 1853 plantation census from Bell's Hollow, a child listed simply as unnamed Albino. The painting was crated and sent to Savannah for preservation. It never arrived. Weeks later, the curator's wife reported finding a small, child-sized handprint scorched into their parlor wall. On the night of April 12, 1880, the skies over Bell's Hollow burned the color of blood. Witnesses from neighboring counties described a rain so thick and red, it stained the wells and left streaks across every church door. Livestock refused to drink. The cornfields looked as though they'd been sown in rust. Old letters from the nearby township of Silver Bend tell of the smell. Metallic, sweet, and ancient, like iron left too long in a wound. People said it wasn't water at all, but memory falling from the clouds. 3 families vanished that night. Their homes were found intact, candles still burning. Only the mirrors were broken. Every shard turned inward, reflecting nothing but black. At dawn, a local minister gathered the survivors for prayer. But when he opened his Bible, the pages were blank except for one line scrawled across the center in an unsteady hand. The boy walks again. After the storm, the fields around the hollow sprouted with colorless weeds, long pale stems that hummed when touched. Scientists later claimed it was fungus, but the locals burned the growth and salted the ground. Rain never fell there again. Even today, the soil remains cracked and dry, as though the land remembers what it once drank. In 1891, a woman named Margaret Tilson moved into what remained of Bell's Hollow. She was a widow, a midwife by trade, seeking silence after the fever took her children. Locals warned her not to stay near the old church grounds, but she said the land felt peaceful, as if the air itself remembered lullabies. For 6 months, she lived alone. Then came the dreams. Every night she saw a boy standing in her doorway, pale, barefoot, his hands folded behind his back. He never spoke. He only stared, his eyes reflecting candlelight like mirrors. Margaret began to paint him, though she swore she didn't know how to paint. Each canvas appeared at dawn beside her bed, the brushwork perfect, the whites too white to be pigment. Neighbors said she stopped eating, stopped speaking. They'd find her on the porch at dusk, whispering to the fields. "He's trying to be born again," she told the doctor from town. "But something's missing. Something human." One morning, a child's footprints led from her front steps toward the chapel ruins. Her door was locked from the inside. The house smelled faintly of salt. On the table lay a final canvas. The same boy, now older, smiling faintly, his hand resting on Margaret's shoulder. Her body was never found. Only her voice remained, faintly pressed into the walls, humming a lullaby that no one recognized. In 1903, a tattered hymnal was discovered in the ruins of Bell's Hollow Chapel. It contained all 150 psalms and one more. The handwriting was faint, uneven, as if copied by a trembling hand. At the top of the page was written, Psalm 151 for the child who remembers God. No church had ever sanctioned it. No scholar recognized its verses. But the words, what could be read of them, felt wrong. Not blasphemous, but weary. Like scripture written by something that had survived the flood but wished it hadn't. The psalm spoke of the pale one who walks in light that burns the righteous, and of a house of salt where prayers rot like fruit. The refrain repeated one line over and over, and he shall teach the earth to dream again. Those who handled the hymnal said it made the air grow heavy, that it left a faint white dust on their fingers. The Bishop of Augusta ordered it sealed in lead and buried under the seminary. But before it was hidden, a student copied the final stanza. It read, "When the 13th psalm is sung, the sky will bleed its memory, and the child will open the door between." The student who transcribed it vanished a week later. His dorm room was found immaculate, except for a single footprint of white ash on his pillow. In 1912, nearly 60 years after the first incident at Bell's Hollow, a letter surfaced in the records of St. Aurelia's orphanage, a home for abandoned children outside Savannah. It was written in careful childlike script and addressed simply to the Reverend who still listens. The letter told of dreams shared among the children, a pale boy who came to them during storms, offering to show them what heaven forgot. The matron dismissed it as imagination. But one night she found 12 of the children standing in the courtyard under the rain, their hands turned upward, whispering the same verse over and over, the refrain from the 13th Psalm. One girl, Annabelle, survived the fever that followed. Years later, in a sanatorium, she recounted her dreams to a visiting doctor. She said the boy wasn't cruel and only lonely, that he lived in the cracks between prayers, and that when he spoke, his voice sounded like everyone she had ever loved, speaking at once. When the doctor asked what he wanted, Anna smiled faintly. "He said the earth has been sleeping too long," she whispered. "He said I was supposed to wake it." Her pulse stopped mid-sentence. When nurses entered, every mirror in her room had fogged over from the inside. In 1923, St. Aurelia's orphanage expanded into a schoolhouse. During construction, workers unearthed a chamber directly beneath the foundation, an oval-shaped room lined with brick and salt. Inside were fragments of benches, hymnals, and over a dozen small skeletons arranged in perfect concentric circles. At the center lay a single vertebra carved with words in Latin, ut memor fiat terra, so the earth may remember. Authorities claimed it was a forgotten burial site from the yellow fever years. But the bones told a different story. No coffins, no grave markings. Each skull bore identical notches along the jaw, as if the children had been made to sing through their teeth. The nuns ordered the site sealed, the ground reconsecrated. Yet after that night, the school bell began ringing at 3:07 a.m. every morning, the exact minute the workers had broken into the chamber. Students reported hearing faint hymns beneath the floorboards, voices too soft to be real, yet harmonizing in perfect thirds. One teacher fainted after describing a child's whisper behind her ear. "He remembers who you forgot." The bell was eventually removed, but the ringing continued for 13 nights after its absence, as if the sound itself refused to stop existing. In 1931, The diocese appointed a historian named Elias Rowan to catalog the remaining artifacts of St. Aurelia's school. He was known for his calm temperament, a man untouched by superstition, yet his journals, found decades later, tell a different story. Rowan began by compiling enrollment records. Most files were ordinary until he noticed one anomaly: a list of students labeled deferred to memory. No ages, no origins, no deaths recorded. Only names, 37 in total, each written in a hand too elegant for clerical ink. He tried to cross-reference them. Every attempt ended in error. The files duplicated themselves overnight, new names appearing, old ones vanishing. When he locked the cabinet, he swore he heard whispering from inside, not pleading but reciting names. Over and over. His final entry was dated March 11th, 1932. They are not ghosts. They are the parts of us we chose to forget. The boy isn't haunting the world. He's writing it again. Rowan disappeared soon after. His office was sealed. When reopened years later, every page of his ledger had been turned to dust except the first. On it, one phrase remained written in salt: "When the last name is remembered, the hollow will breathe again." The archivist's spectacles were found resting on the desk, lenses fogged from the inside, though the room was cold. In 1938, the ruins of Bell's Hollow Chapel were briefly excavated by a team of restoration scholars from Emory. They expected rubble, scripture fragments, perhaps a few rusted relics. What they found was a single object, perfectly preserved: a mirror, 8 feet tall, rimmed with ivory and tarnished gold, half buried in the nave. No one could explain how it had survived the fire, its surface unbroken, its reflection dark and slow, as if light hesitated before entering. Etched across the frame were Latin words worn smooth by time: "Non Deus vide, Deus es visus." God does not see, God is seen. The scholars brought it to Atlanta for study, but within days each fell ill, sleepless, trembling, obsessed with returning to the hollow. One by one they claimed they'd glimpsed a face in the mirror, not their own. A pale child standing behind them, watching through the glass, mouthing a psalm that didn't exist. When the head curator sealed the artifact, the reflection persisted, faintly visible even after the covering was drawn. The mirror was placed in storage, mislabeled as unidentified ecclesiastical relic. Records end there. But in the museum basement logs, a final note appears, written decades later in another hand: "Every seventh night, the glass breathes." In 1944, the seminary of Augusta suffered the worst storm in its history. For 3 days, rain fell without pause, flooding the lower wings. Students were evacuated, save for the archivists who remained to protect the vault, the one built decades earlier to bury the 13th Psalm. When the waters receded, the seminary stood silent. The west wing had cracked open, the lead-sealed chamber exposed. Inside there were no books, no relics, only water, pale and still like milk left in the sun. Witnesses claimed the water glowed faintly, illuminating scripture carved directly into the stone floor. None recognized the language, but one word repeated throughout: Memoria. For weeks the air around the seminary stayed damp and heavy. Professors reported hearing voices echoing through the pipes, a child's voice, calm, reciting verses backward. A janitor swore the drains whispered names at night. When workers pumped out the last of the floodwater, they found something pressed against the vault wall, a single handprint, small, bone-white, set deep into the cement as though from the inside. The seminary closed that winter. Before leaving, the head priest performed one final rite. He ended his record with the line, "We tried to bury memory, but memory learned how to breathe." By 1949, Bell's Hollow was little more than rumor, a patch of dead land fenced off by memory and time. But a man named Jonas Creel ignored both. He was a caretaker of forgotten places, hired by the state to maintain old roads and lost cemeteries. Locals called him the Lantern Keeper. Jonas lived in a cabin near the hollow's edge, claiming he preferred its quiet. Every night he walked the old paths, lantern in hand, marking graves no one remembered. He said the silence there felt alive, like a sleeping throat. In his final field journal, he wrote that some nights the ground trembled faintly beneath his boots, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He began hearing voices when he walked, children reciting psalms, a man humming, a woman laughing softly just beyond the light. On his last entry, dated November 3, 1949, Jonas described seeing a child standing among the weeds, pale, still, watching. He raised his lantern, but the boy only lifted a hand, palm outward, as if mirroring him. That night, the lantern light was seen across the valley, brighter than fire, pulsing like breath, then vanished. When authorities found his cabin, his boots stood by the door, wet with salt. A single word was carved into the table beside his open journal: wake. In 1950, a team of folklorists, curious about the lost legends of Georgia, dared to return to Bell's Hollow. They were scholars armed with notebooks and skepticism. They called it research. The locals called it madness. The hollow had changed. The forest had grown thick, roots twisting like veins across the ruins of the chapel. Paths they expected to find were gone, replaced by soft soil that seemed to absorb their weight. The air carried the scent of salt and something older, a trace of fire that had never burned. Inside the ruins they found remnants of the west wing, cracked and hollowed by decades of water and wind. Nothing else moved. But when one of the men stepped across the threshold, he claimed the air itself whispered names. Names he had never known but recognized. At the center of the floor, faint depressions formed a circle. Scholars who bent to measure them recoiled as the ground seemed to pulse beneath their knees. One woman swore she felt a hand rest lightly on her shoulder, cold, small, impossibly light, and heard a child whisper, "You have returned too late." No one ever fully explained what they saw. Some journals from that expedition disappear from the archives. Others record only the same line repeatedly in trembling ink. The hollow remembers. The boy remembers. We are nothing. They called him Devil's White. Not because he was evil, but because he carried memory where others could not. Bell's Hollow was his canvas, the soil his ledger, and every whisper, every forgotten name, part of what he preserved. By 1950, the boy was no longer a boy. Witnesses claimed to see him wandering among ruins, pale as bone, hair like linen threads, eyes reflecting everything they had forgotten. He did not speak, and yet his presence demanded recognition, a testimony written, not with words but with attention. Scholars, who approached too closely, left with fevered dreams and journals, filled with phrases they could not decipher. The earth learns to dream through him. The hollow breathes in him. He remembers. Legends say he would appear at dawn in fields long abandoned, hands raised as if conducting a choir no one else could hear. Farmers swore the rivers ran clearer when he passed. Children who glimpsed him swore they saw faces of ancestors in his eyes, all singing silently, asking for remembrance. The last record of him is from a priest who traveled to Bell's Hollow to confront him. He wrote only, "I asked if he was God's child or man's. He looked at me and the wind answered." Since then, the hollow has remained empty to the world. But some nights when rain falls slowly on broken stone, you can hear it, faint, precise, and waiting. A child's voice reciting the psalm of memory, teaching the earth to remember itself once more.